devotional, and then we'll go to prayer. But we need to remember a lot of people in the church that are sick. Pastor's still sick. He has had a fever. He just doesn't feel well, which is all signs of the flu. So we need to pray for him. And I had heard that Angie was sick, but she's walking. So are the kids sick, or they're all well?
No, Aaron's feeling better. James.
Okay, all right. So let's open with prayer. I'm going to ask Ted. Ted, if you would just open in prayer and especially pray for those that are sick.
Father, we want to, first of all, thank you and praise you again, Lord, for who you are, Lord, and for the way you direct in this world and in our personal lives. Lord, we just praise you and thank you for the privilege, the opportunity that we have to come tonight to study from your word and to learn more and to be more obedient as we learn. And Father, we do want to remember to pray, first of all, for the families that have been involved today in this school shooting, the families that have lost loved ones, Lord. We pray for them and for those who have been injured or wounded that are in hospitals right now being tended to. Father, we would pray for the wounded and just pray for them that, Lord, if it would please you, you would heal their bodies, and pray for the families that are grieving, and just pray that you would comfort them. Most of all, Lord, we would pray that through this somehow the gospel message would be made clear and plain to the folks that are grieving, and to the ones who are hurt, and even to the perpetrator, Lord, and to the law enforcement. And just pray that through this people might turn to you, really turn to you, not just for a second or a moment, not just say words like we're praying for you on TV, and Lord, but really turn to you. And Lord, pray that help our nation see that back before the Bible and prayer was taken out of the school, there weren't 18 school shootings the first month of the year. Lord, help our nation see the sin and wickedness that we're in. Ideas that I'm among people, wickedness, my lips are wicked. Lord, please forgive us. Just pray, Lord, for turning hearts and minds toward you, Christian, to be real Christians in this United States of America. Instead of phonies or half-baked Christians, stand with the Lord. Father, we pray for those among us that are sick physically today. Just pray, Lord, that you heal them, bring them back safe, heal them, bring them back so they can function properly. We would like as you minister the word tonight, Lord, help each of us to be faithful. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. If you have your Bibles, if you'd turn to Acts, and we're going to start out in the 21st chapter, and we are going to end up right around the 25th chapter. But this is the story, and I think most of you probably know the story of Paul, and when he was came into Jerusalem, and he was in the synagogue for about 12 days, and preaching what they called the way, and all of a sudden, if you look at verse 30 in Acts 21, they decided that they were going to beat Paul for the way that he was preaching of Jesus Christ. Notice what it says, and then all the city was provoked, and the people rushed together, and taking hold of Paul, they dragged him out of the temple And immediately the doors were shut. And while they were seeking to kill him, a report came to the Roman cohort that all Jerusalem was in confusion. And basically, Jerusalem was in a riot. And they were rioting because of Paul, and they were beating Paul. And if you notice later on in chapter 21, when the soldiers arrived, verse 33, then the commander came up and took hold of him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains, and he'd been asking him, who was he? And what had he done? And the crowd didn't help the centurion or the soldier understand what he had been done, because some were shouting one thing, some were shouting another thing, some were shouting, do away with him. And the soldiers took him to the barracks, and as they were leading him up the stairs of the barracks, he waved his hand and he said to the soldiers, hey, let me say a few things to the people. And the soldier said, okay. So Paul waved his hand, and we start there with chapter 22, where Paul starts addressing his brethren and fathers. Hear my defense, which I now offer to you. And when he heard that they were being addressed in Hebrew, they became very quiet. And he told them that he was a Jew. And he was a Jew born in Tarsus of Cilicia. But then went on and talked about the way that he had originally persecuted the way. And he gives the story of his conversion on the road to Damascus. And then in verse 24, the commander orders him to be brought into the barracks, stating that he should be examined by scourging so that he might find out the reason why they were shouting against him that way. They stretched him out with thongs. Paul said to the centurion who was standing by, is it lawful for you to scourge a man who is a Roman and condemned? That brought immediate relief to Paul, saying that he was a Roman citizen. And he went to his commander and he says, what are we going to do about this? And the commander came and said, tell me, are you a Roman? And he said, yes. The commander answered, I acquired this citizenship with a large sum of money. And Paul said, I was actually born a citizen. So they immediately started treating him a little bit nicer than they were before. So now we get to the end of chapter 22. The next day, wishing to know for certain why he had been accused by the Jews, the commander released him and ordered the chief priests and all the council to assemble, and brought Paul down and set Paul down before him. And so therefore, Paul is now appearing before the council, or the Sanhedrin, which is the ruling body of the Jews, and he addresses them, and didn't do much good, because they had a great dissension. If you look in verse 10 of chapter 23, there occurred a great uproar. And why was there an uproar? You remember what Paul did in the council? What he said? Gary.
Verse 8 about resurrection, no resurrection.
I believe in the resurrection of the dead. Well, the Pharisees did, and the other part of the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees, did not. So now they started arguing back and forth what was right. And, even, as I read this for tonight, what did it remind me of? Reminded me exactly of Washington. One side says this, the other side says this, but that's for a different night, I guess. So anyhow, they had Paul, And they had him at a location, and there was a plot against Paul. And the soldiers took him out of this place where he was, and they escorted him to Caesarea. Now, Kevin, you want to flip that slide up there? And this, some of us who went to Israel can remember this picture well, but this is the area of Caesarea. This is the area of Herod's palace, right on the Mediterranean. There was a theater there was a hippodrome for chariot races, just a number of huge area. And that's where Paul was taken. And that's where Paul would reside for at least the next 2 years. Because we are finally now in chapter 24 going to get down to the business that we are here for. And starting in chapter 24, the Jewish orator or lawyer, Tertullian, delivers his charge against Paul. And basically he had 3 charges. The first one was Paul was a troublemaker, literally a pest or a plague, stirring up riots among the Jews. And as apt to do, the lawyer spread a big net instead of just a little net, because he said that Paul was stirring up riots among the Jews throughout the entire civilized world. If you read verses 5 and 6, you'll see that. Now, at first glance, this seems to be a ridiculous charge. But on the other hand, a bit of name calling without anything specific, but actually it was a carefully calculated move. Compare the charge with that of the Asian Jews way back before all this riot and everything started, back in chapter 21, verse 28. And they too had charged Paul with causing trouble everywhere. But they had correctly seen it as involving Jewish law and the temple. Tertullius attempted to broaden the scope a bit, so Paul was provoking insurrection throughout the Roman world. That casts a different light on the situation, because it was okay as far as the Romans were concerned. He could do whatever he wanted. He could cast whatever dispersion he wanted to cast on the Jews. But wait a minute, when you start casting dispersion on the Caesar, now that's a different story, and that's sedition. So, he kind of moved this into a seditious charge, and the Romans official would take seriously any threat to what was called the Pax Romana at that time. Felix in particular would have become attentive at the hint of such a charge. His entire administration, if you go back and study Jewish history and Roman history at this time, his entire administration had been marked by having to put down one insurrection in Judea after another. He had done so decisively and cruelly, and he maintained peace at any cost. Tertullius' second charge was really a variation on the same theme. Paul was a ringleader of the Nazarene sect. Now, this was true. Paul was a Christian leader at this time. But by linking the comment with the charge of provoking insurrection, Tertullius implied that the Christians as a whole were dangerous and a seditious sect. And Paul was one of their main collaborators. So the ramifications of the Jewish charges now became infinitely clear. Should such a charge be made to stick for Paul, the whole Christian community would be viewed as a dangerous, revolutionary movement. Now, fortunately here, Tertullius could not substantiate the charge. And Felix was already too informed about Christians to take it seriously. If you look at verse 22 in chapter 24, see, but Felix, having a more excellent knowledge about the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias, the commander, comes down, I will decide your case. So the third charge against Paul here was that Paul had violated the temple. Now, evidently, the Romans, although they granted the Jews the right to enforce their ban on Gentile access to their sacred places, Paul had been charged by the Asian Jews back in chapter 21 of violating that ban. Now, if Tertullius had substantiated that charge, it would have been, he would have been, Felix that is, would have been obligated to turn Paul over to jurisdiction of the Sanhedrin. And we know what the Sanhedrin would have done with Paul by chapter 23. They wanted to kill him. They wanted to execute him. But the accusation was based on erroneous conclusion by the Asian Jews, again, referring back to chapter 21. And lo and behold, guess who wasn't present at this presentation? The Asian Jews had somehow managed not to come to this particular proceeding. So if we notice in chapter 24, we go back to 10 for a minute, that is verse 10, perhaps indicating here of his sense of power and the fact that he did have a lot of power, without a word, by a mere nodding of his head, Felix gestured for Paul to enter upon his defense. Now, Paul began, and if you look how he began, said, "Knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense." Well, that's a pretty good move on Paul's part. He's trying to puff up Felix to, make him feel good. And we'll get to the name Felix in a minute. But he was not stretching the truth. He was only making a reference to Felix having been a judge over the Jewish nation, which would qualify him to handle the matter at hand. Verse 10. Paul then answered the charges. First came the charge of stirring up insurrection. Paul answered this with a threefold response. First, he had no history of inciting the Jews. He had only been in Jerusalem for 12 days at the time of his arrest and had been there solely to worship. Paul responded to the charges that somehow his treasonous behavior was bound up with his being a ringleader of the Nazarene sect, and he used this opportunity to deliver sort of a mini sermon here, changing his defensive posture to one of a positive witness. And then in verses 17 through 19, Paul's response to Tertullius' third charge, the accusation that he had desecrated the temple, Paul briefly summarized what he had done. His presence in the temple was for purification in connection with the vows of 4 Nazarites and the disturbance created by the Asian Jews. The absence of the Asian Jews at his trial comes at no surprise. Luke had already explained that their accusation that Paul had violated the temple was based on a totally false conclusion, drawn on having seen him earlier in the city with a non-Jew. The outcome of the trial could only be described in the terms of the procurator's or Felix's decision, his refusal to give a verdict. In a rather technical legal language, Luke stated that Felix adjourned the proceedings, meaning that he refused to pass judgment until he had gained further evidence. Now, I don't know how many of you know this, but I want to give you a little bit of insight into Felix's life. The reader is first introduced to Felix here with his wife, Drusilla. And we go back to the historian Josephus, and he related the unusual circumstances of Felix's marriage, and evidently this Drusilla was a strikingly beautiful woman. And the topic must have been of a major, how do we want to say this, rumor or gossip in Palestine. Drusilla was Felix's third wife. And she was actually born in about 38. So you remember this has taken place in about 54, 55. And she was the youngest daughter of Agrippa the First. This is the Herod of Acts chapter 12. At age 14, she was espoused and arranged for a marriage by her brother Agrippa II, and she was wed to a king of Emesa, which was a Syrian petty state. Struck by her beauty, Felix determined to have her for himself. Through the mediation of a Cypriot magician named Adamus, Drusilla, who was herself unhappy in her marriage to this king, was talked into leaving him for the procurator. Josephus mentions that Felix promised to make her happy. Doubtless a pun on the name Felix. Felix is the Latin word for happy. Drusilla was 16 at the time of her marriage to the Judean procurator, and she might have been the source of information on the way, we see in verse 22 here, as well as the driving force behind the desire to speak with Paul in private. So whatever the driving force behind the desire of the couple to visit Paul, and this is all after the proceedings are adjourned, the apostle used the opportunity to share the gospel with them and spoke about faith in Christ. See that in verse 24. Now, for this particular couple, he focused on the prospect of the coming judgment. His emphasis on righteousness was surely intended in a more strictly ethical connection or connotation of measuring up to God's standards, which will ultimately be the basis for the coming judgment. The relevance of self-control to this subject and to their own particular situation was probably very self-evident to Felix and Drusilla. It surely explains Felix's alarm and abrupt curtailment of the conversation with Paul. Luke added even more telling comment on the procurator by noting that he sent for Paul frequently for hopes of getting a bribe. Now, such bribe-taking was frowned upon officially, even forbidden, but it was rampant in the Roman administration. Other Judean procurators were known for their propensity to receive bribes, and obviously, as has been seen, Felix was not above temptation. I want us to look, and this is coming down to the conclusion here, in verse 25. And some translations say, I'll read the whole verse in this translation, but I really like, and Art, you'll love this. I really like the King James Version that's used here, but this is the way it says in my version. But as he was discussing righteousness, self-control, and the judgment to come, Felix became frightened and said, "Go away for the present, and when I find time, I will summon you." The King James Version says, "And as he, Paul, reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled." A little bit stronger word than frightened. He trembled. Now, someone has entitled this verse as saying, "Goodbye to God." What can we think of a man who heard the word of the Lord so plainly that he trembled and then did nothing about it? Paul was on trial, but he was able to deny and refute all the charges against him and actually turned it around, and in essence through here was charging Felix and Drusilla with sin. You know, the name Felix, as I said before, meant happy. Isn't it amazing here that Paul was the one that was happy? He could say, like the young 20th century convert, "Now I'm gladder when I am sad than I used to be when I was glad." You got to think about that one for a minute. I'll repeat it. "Now I'm gladder when I'm sad than I used to be when I was glad." You know, Paul put before Felix the plain demands of God, righteousness and temperance or divine judgment. And Paul very definitely knew his congregation. It's really kind of interesting. If we look at the word trembled, it means literally that he was alarmed and terrified. If we go back into the original languages. So Felix here was alarmed and he was terrified. And this was clearly an opportunity that was missed. Felix was a man of bad habits. And the worst of them was procrastination. His favorite proverb, his proverb must have been, put off till tomorrow what you should do today. Because he didn't make a decision. He didn't make a decision about Paul. He didn't make a decision about Christ. And you know, we've been talking about discipleship and what we should be doing. Well, discipleship starts, and the first chapter of our book, or the first section of our book that we're studying in Sunday school, starts out with what? Starts out with how do we lead somebody to Christ? You know, what should we be doing? And you know, Paul was doing that. And we have to ask ourselves the question as to what should we be doing. I think we've been challenged by in the last couple of weeks. And I must confess, I've been negligent in this area. But who have you selected to disciple? You ought to be able to take a piece of paper right now and write down a name, or write down the name of a couple as to who you have been challenged to disciple. Or the other side of the coin is, if you believe that you need to be discipled, choose somebody. Go up to them. Say, hey, would you work with me? Would you read the Bible with me? Would you go through this discipleship program that we have and we've been studying and that we've been starting and that we heard about in our evangelistic crusade? You know, this is the core group right here. Oh, there's some others, but this is the core group. And every one of us, and I'll admit, I don't have a name yet, but every one of us should have a name as to somebody who at least we are going to approach and say, let's sit down and read the Bible together. Let's talk about what we should be doing. So that's the message of the night. If you have your prayer prompter, a couple of things to